1944, Japan was already at a great disadvantage in the war. Despite having begun the conflict with one of the most advanced aircraft of the time, the Mitsubishi A6M0, this fighter had become obsolete in the final stages of the war. By 1945, the Zeros were outclassed by the modern American fighters F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair. As a result, many units were modified for suicide missions. Parts of the fuselage were removed to increase fuel and explosive capacity, thus amplifying the impact of the collision. These aircraft became known as kamikazes. Kamikaze attacks began to be widely used in the Philippines during the Battle of Leyte Gulf and also in Okinawa. The most famous case was the sinking of the escort carrier USS Street Low, struck by a bomb-laden Zero in Leyte, becoming the first American aircraft carrier destroyed by a kamikaze attack. In Okinawa, successive waves of kamikaze Zeros caused severe damage to major ships, including the aircraft carrier USS Bunker Hill, which lost nearly 400 men after suffering 2 direct hits in succession. The Zero was born from an audacious demand of the Imperial Japanese Navy in the late 1930s. They wanted a carrier-based fighter superior to everything else in the world. Fast, extremely maneuverable, long-ranged, and still capable of operating from aircraft carriers. The mission was assigned to engineer Jiro Horikoshi from Mitsubishi. He and his team created a revolutionary plane for the time, the Mitsubishi A6M0, named after the Japanese Imperial Year 2600, corresponding to 1940, when it entered service. But the secret of the Zero was not in having more armor or greater firepower than its rivals. In fact, it was the exact opposite. Horikoshi bet on an extremely lightweight design, using a special aluminum alloy called extra super duralumin, which made the structure strong yet light. The result was a fighter with an empty weight of only 1,680 kilograms, much lighter than American and British fighters of the era. This lightness gave the Zero incredible maneuverability, capable of executing turns that left opponents completely defenseless. In the hands of experienced pilots, the aircraft seemed to dance in the sky. The heart of the Zero was the Nakajima Sakai 12 radial engine, with 940 horsepower in the first version. That may sound modest compared to Allied engines, which soon reached 1,200, 1,500, and even 2,000 horsepower. But in the Zero's case, its lightness made all the difference. It reached a top speed of 533 kilometers per hour, an impressive figure at the start of the war. But the most astonishing aspect was its range, 1,900 kilometers in combat missions, and over 3,000 kilometers with external fuel tanks, double or even triple that of most fighters of the time. This immense autonomy allowed the plane to launch long-range attacks from its carriers, which proved decisive in 1941 and 1942. As for armament, the Zero was equipped with 2 7.7mm machine guns and 2 20mm cannons, heavier than many early rivals such as the American Curtiss P-40 or the British Hawker Hurricane. Its true advantage, however, lay in the combination of lightness, range, firepower, and maneuverability. It was an aircraft designed to strike first and destroy before the enemy could react. But of course, there was a price. To keep the weight low, the Zero had virtually no armor for the pilot and no protection for its fuel tanks. If hit, it usually became a fireball. Yet at the start of the war, this weakness had not been exploited. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the Zero was at its peak and considered the best fighter in the world. The lowest point in the Zero's history came in June 1944 during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Desperate to stop the American offensive in the Mariana Islands, Japan launched more than 400 aircraft against the enemy fleet, most of them Mitsubishi Zeros. But times had changed. The Americans now had the F-6F Hellcat, a faster, better armored fighter with greater firepower. In addition, U.S. carriers were equipped with radar, which guided defending squadrons with unprecedented precision. The result was an aerial massacre. In a single day, about 300 Japanese aircraft were shot down, most of them Zeros. For American pilots, downing the fragile enemy planes became so easy that the episode went down in history as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. This defeat virtually annihilated Japanese naval aviation. Japan's carriers, once the pride of the fleet, were reduced to mere floating targets, with too few fighters left to defend them. Months later, in October 1944, the Zeros were once again launched en masse, this time in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, considered the largest naval battle in history. Japan committed its last forces in an attempt to halt the American reconquest of the Philippines. Hundreds of Zeros were deployed in attack and escort missions. But faced with American air superiority and the lack of veteran pilots, the results were disastrous once again. Many Japanese aviators were young and inexperienced, hurriedly thrown into already outdated aircraft. The combats were so unbalanced that, in some cases, entire formations of Zeros were wiped out before even reaching their targets. It is estimated that Japan lost more than 500 aircraft in this battle, an irrecoverable number. The Japanese High Command officially adopted kamikaze attacks beginning at Leyte, modifying Zeros to carry explosives and launching them as human projectiles against American ships. The last major episode in which the Zero was used in large numbers occurred in Okinawa in 1945, already in the final throes of the war. Unable to face American fighters in the air, Japan converted the Zero almost exclusively into a kamikaze aircraft. Thousands of units were modified, with armor and equipment removed to carry more fuel and explosives. The attacks were organized in waves, sending dozens of Zeros against the American fleet. Some attacks were successful, such as the one that struck the USS Bunker Hill, killing nearly 400 men, but the cost was unimaginable. In just 3 months of fighting at Okinawa, Japan lost more than 1,500 aircraft, most of them Zeros. At first, it was believed that Japan was incapable of developing cutting-edge aircraft, a costly underestimation. The first encounters with the Zero were traumatic. Pilots accustomed to fighters like the P-40 Warhawk or the F-4F Wildcat discovered the hard way that they could not challenge the Zero in tight turns. The famous dogfights, the Japanese plane would simply circle around them and fire before they could react. The turning point came in 1942, when the Americans recovered a nearly intact Zero that had crashed in Alaska. This aircraft was thoroughly tested, revealing all the weaknesses of the Japanese fighter: fragile structure, lack of armor, vulnerable fuel tanks, and difficulty in high-speed dives. With this knowledge, the Allies devised new tactics, such as the famous Thatch Weave. Imagine two fighters flying side by side, at some distance. When a Zero moved in to attack one, both pilots began turning toward each other in synchronized maneuvers, crossing paths like an X. The Zero, in pursuing one fighter, was automatically exposed to the sights of the other. This tactic proved highly effective, but from 1943 onward, the situation changed radically. The United States introduced far more powerful fighters such as the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair, both with engines exceeding 2,000 horsepower, heavy armor, and overwhelming firepower. These new planes not only outperformed the Zero in speed and armament but could also withstand much more damage. While a Zero often burst into flames after just a few hits, a Hellcat could return home riddled with bullets. Japan did attempt to modernize the Zero, producing improved versions with engines up to 1,560 horsepower, but the basic structure, designed to be lightweight and maneuverable, was already obsolete. Its intended successor, the A-7M Repu, arrived too late and in too few numbers to make a difference. Moreover, Japan faced another severe problem: the lack of experienced pilots. The veterans who had shown at Pearl Harbor and in the Philippines died throughout the war, and there was no time to train adequate replacements. As a result, Zeros fell in droves against the tide of American aircraft, which were mass-produced industrially and flown by well-trained novices. In the last years of the war, the Zero's fate grew even more tragic. With overwhelming Allied air superiority, Japan increasingly resorted to suicide missions. The Zero, once seen as an invincible fighter, became the aircraft most commonly used in kamikaze attacks. Loaded with bombs of up to 500 kilograms, it dove against American ships in one-way missions. Some of these attacks inflicted devastating damage, such as against the USS Bunker Hill, which was seriously damaged. But in the end, these sacrifices did nothing to change the course of the war. In total, about 10,000, 900 units of the A6M0 were built between 1940 and 1945. It was the most produced Japanese fighter of the war and also the most famous. It forced the Allies to develop new tactics, new aircraft, and a more advanced air combat doctrine.